So first off, I'm Alex Hardman, a technical marketing engineer with LaunchDarkly. Before I joined LaunchDarkly, I worked in the enterprise for about 15 years in the financial services sector. And the reason why I like talking about migration so much is because I spent so many years doing migrations. That is, migrations to the cloud, modernizing in the cloud, going from, and this kind of gets us into what is migrating mean. And so for me, it means, and this good level set for us, it's moving your applications, data, compute, or infrastructure from one place to another. And so let's unpack that a little bit. So as an example, if you're moving from on-prem to the cloud, say you have a database, which is a thing that I think a lot of us have gone through that or are going through that. Also, if you're modernizing in the cloud, so moving from self-hosted database or self-hosted application to more cloud native or serverless offerings. All of those to me count as migrations. Additionally, you can think of migrations as really just any changes in that infrastructure. And so the other way that I sweep into that migrations bucket is moving from one API version to another. So often when we change API versions, there's breaking changes between, say, version 1 and version 2, which means that there can be a lot of pain in that change. And additionally, we can have operational changes like authentication or other things have changed, like the responsiveness. And so because of that, migrations are scary. Because each time we make one of these moves and things don't work as expected, if we roll that out to our entire production user base at once, that blast radius is huge. It can have a really significant damaging effect on our users and our business. And so rightfully so many teams and organizations approach migrations kind of with trepidation and fear. But the thing is, migrations don't have, hit the scroll in the wrong. Here's the thing, migrations don't have to be scary though. You should be able to introduce new infrastructure, databases, APIs, and other functionality without fear and transition gradually. You need to be able to use your existing APM tools to monitor and respond so that you can keep up with your SLAs and meet your customers' expectations. And because every migration inherently has a lot of risk to it, you want to be able to leverage your existing governance and change control processes so that you have the right oversight on changes you're making. So here's some of what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a live demo in just a few. I'm just going to do a little bit more setting the stage about migration here. So what we're going to cover here, we're going to show you a migration, and we're going to show you how it can fail. And when it fails, we're going to instantly roll it back. We're also going to look at the controls that LaunchDarkly gives you for how to mitigate the risk across the rollout of your migration, decreasing the blast radius, and linking features together so that they can ship together. We'll also get into how you can automate your recovery using existing APM tooling like Datadog, New Relic, Dynatrace, or integrate any other tools using our webhooks. And finally, we'll put into practice how we can add governance and guardrails to help support our team so that we don't have missteps and so we can have that oversight that we need in any large risky change. So for any successful migration, there are a key set of ingredients. For every migration that's going to be successful and not scary, we need to be able to react quickly. We also need a full control over how we transition. No more big bang migrations. And we need a way to match our business's need for change control and processes. I worked in the financial services sector, and that is a space that's rife with regulation and over process overhead. Some of it maybe is a little heavy, and some of it's really necessary. And so your tools have to be able to match your needs. The other thing we need is smarter ops. You shouldn't have to sit and watch dashboards or wait for an alarm to go off to tell you have to go fix something. Our tools are already smart enough to work together. It's just time to wire them together and automatically remediate issues that pop up, especially ones that we can see coming. So, we've talked a little bit about how scary migrations can be and how intimidating they are and why, some of the challenges of them, and some of what we're going to do today to walk through how to make that less painful. Uh, LaunchDarkly, at its core, what it gives you that helps with migration is it helps remove that need to compromise between speed and risk. So often we approach migrations slowly and cautiously. We take a lot of time during those testing cycles, spanning environments, uh, just to try and build up that confidence, which means we're compromising the speed with which we deliver. It costs us our development time, it costs us the benefit of getting to that new technology sooner. And so often things still break in production. And so for years, I was a builder. And so all of these pains here are really close to my heart because I think I felt them all. Um, as I was saying, big, scary changes, we tend to go slowly and take longer. And I think it's sort of out of this abundance of caution, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate the issues that we have. Um, because nobody's actually ever certain that it's going to work, even if all the tests pass. There's also in migrations, we so often have to do a lot of cross team coordination, which gets painful really quickly. It's complex. And if you've ever heard about the concept of, say, two pizza teams, um, that is fundamentally based on reducing the amount of inter team communication we have to do because that's how we go faster. Um, Third, when things go wrong during a migration, it's usually a whole process to get us back out of it. There's a pipeline to run. There might be variables to change. Uh, we have to redeploy or recycle. And all of that comes down to that it's time. It's time that we have to live in a broken state, that we shouldn't have to. Please. The other part is it's expensive enough to run a data center or to build in the cloud. If you ever see what those cloud bills look like, they're not small. But you can imagine how that cost just starts to multiply. Well, we need a production environment, of course. But how many non-production environments do we need? Oh, maybe we need a pre-production and a staging, probably a performance environment, a test environment, a development environment. And now you've multiplied those costs of production environment. And again, even if you do all the due diligence up front, the testing, you do a lot of analysis and assessment and design, things break all the time. And so hopes and prayers won't be enough. So that last pseudocode snippet that we saw, this one here that's on the screen, it's so simple, but it actually buys us a lot. Let's talk a little bit about that. It looks like just a basic Boolean condition, you know, and if migration is on, go here. If migration is off, go there. But there's a lot more to it. First, this is what enables us to have a kill switch, so we can instantly revert when things go wrong. And thanks to LaunchDarkly's advanced targeting, it's a way to control the rollout and transition over to the new infrastructure, database, or API progressively. Backed by LaunchDarkly, this feature flag also can match whatever your governance model is with approvals and workflows. And finally, LaunchDarkly has a massive suite of integrations, and an API first approach in their platform, which means you can integrate any platform with LaunchDarkly. So let's lay out a few basic concepts, just a little bit of language, and then we're just about this far from the demo and some pretty cool stuff. Okay, we'll start with this idea of targeting and context. And this may be unfamiliar, so we'll unpack a little here, and then that'll lead us where into how we're going to control that blast radius around releases. So here you can see on this screen, we have a if the context is that this is from the US West region, you can see that we're saying new database is on, and we're going to the new database. Otherwise, new database is off, and we go to the old database. Now, right now, it looks like this is code that we would write. But when you use LaunchDarkly feature flags and the rules engine that's behind those for evaluating them, you don't have to write code like this anymore. So let's look at what that looks like. So here's this in practice. We take an existing front end, and originally it's talking to its back end. That's the old back end, which is talking to the old database. You can see as we switch on this toggle, we're able to now direct the front end to start talking to a new back-end API. And we can still talk to the old database through the new API. Again, now we've started to reduce that blast radius of a migration. We can control which pieces of infrastructure or change in a migration that we adopt and how we adopt them. And now, when we target the new database, or sorry, when we turn on the path to the new database, the new API is talking to it instead. What's key, though, is combining those concepts about gating those different parts of your infrastructure in a migration or different parts of a migration is targeting. And so thanks to that targeting that we're talking about in LaunchDarkly and the rules engine behind that, you don't have to write any of that targeting code. I've written that before. It's complex. It's hard to get right. And because LaunchDarkly's targeting allows you to target based on anything you know about a request, as you can see here, we have things like a user's name or email. We also have location information. Anything you're gathering from your clients, you can use to target a request. Okay, so now we're going to jump into a live demo where we get into how we manage a migration, the pains in the process, and what we can do about it. Okay, and so I'm going to put, whoops, hold on. Sorry, technical difficulties. I don't know where my screen went. Okay, there's code. We're looking at that later. Also code. This is our live demo. I'm going to jump right into it now because I lost my slide share. All right. So you'll see this is a familiar picture to what we just saw. So what I've done here is I built a React application. This is deployed. Oh, and that's right, because I couldn't show you the slide, I couldn't show you the address. I'm going to paste the addresses into the chat now. Give me just one moment. So this is the demo site, so you can visit it. And this is the link to the source code for this as well. If anybody has any trouble with that, please reach out in chat, and Hillary can hit me up for any technical difficulties we're having there. Okay, so what we've got here is this React app. It's deployed on Netlify. And so anybody can go and reach this now. And you should see the same thing I'm seeing here, which is that our front end is wired up to talk to our old API, which is talking to the old database. So what we're going to do now is do a series of transitions or progressively migrate across to a new API and to the new database. Just for technical purposes, what else is behind this other than the React app? So we're using the LaunchDarkly React SDK. So if you want to see some of that in action after the fact, we'll get into a little code here. All the source code is pushed up to GitHub, so feel free to take a peek there as well. Additionally, the back end of this is in AWS. It was built using the AWS CDK. And what we're using for the API is a API gateway, which has two versions, version 1 and version 2. It's backed by a Lambda function. The Lambda function is using the LaunchDarkly Node SDK. And then the two databases are, the new database is DynamoDB, and the old database is an S3 bucket where we're using S3 select to query data in that bucket. All right. So first, I'm going to show you one of my favorite use cases, and it's an operational use case. It's a tool I wish I had all along. And so I'm going to do a little adjusting on the screen here to move things around as needed. So what I'm going to do first is turn on a debug menu. And so this was a tool I wish I'd had, because not that you can't build in debug tools, the problem is targeting, or who gets to see them. And so thanks to LaunchDarkly targeting, it gets really easy. So what I'm going to do is turn this on for everybody right now. So any folks that are on the site, you're going to see a new button pop up. If you'll keep your eyes on my screen or your own, this change happens very quickly, and it's going to happen in the upper right corner. And so as soon as I change this, you can see we now have a debug button. And so what I'm going to do is just slide this over just a little bit so that I can open up that debug panel. Now, you'll notice I have to resize things here. So what we can see is the diagram hasn't changed. We haven't changed any functionality in this migration yet. This is just a way to surface the data that's coming back from our API, because I wanted you to not only have a visual representation here, but to see the data that was coming back as we migrate. Okay, so I won't do it now because I want you all to have access to this debug panel. But as an example of targeting, here's how we might apply something like this. And so with our debug panel here, you can see that what we could do is target a segment of users. And in this case, it would be our delivery team. So you can imagine that every time our team is looking at this in production, they might want to get this same debug information, get the information about what data source is being used or what API version is being used. In this case, I've made this available to everyone. And I'm going to briefly pull this back. I'm going to show you what targeting looks like in this case. So you'll see we lose the debug panel. And what I'm going to do now is turn on the ability to log in. I have a bug here, so we're just going to turn this back on too. Okay, I have a problem with the debug with the login, so that's all right. We're going to skip that part. Essentially, what would happen there is that logging in as a user, I could show you that the delivery team that's targeted here has some set of users, and in this case, I just targeted one user as developer. I think I broke the login feature earlier today, so that's what I get for making changes last minute. I'm going to turn that off for now, since it's clearly causing an issue. Great. And again, I guess that does bring us back to that speed with which I can recover. So I released a feature, login. It broke, and it broke my debug feature at the same time. And so I was instantly able to retrack that. When you make a change in LaunchDarkly, as I did here, it's broadcast globally in under 200 milliseconds. And so that's why you see that instantaneous response. That's for both the back end and the front end. All right, let's keep going here. So now we're seeing where our data is coming from. We can see we're on API version 1. And we can see through the visual depiction here, I'm going to hide the debug just so we can get a little bit bigger graphic here. You can see we're flowing to the old API. So let's change that. So we're going to go ahead and turn on our feature here. And so when I save this change, you'll see that I'm serving the API version 2 configuration. And if it's off, which is what's the state now, is serving the API version 1 configuration. Oh, I'm glad to hear. So other people could see login. It was probably just something about my interface here. Oh, well, that's a relief. So, okay. And I believe I left, yeah, I left debug targeted at everybody. So everybody still has the debug panel if they want it. Thanks for letting me know, everybody. I felt badly that I broke it for this. So that's a relief. All right. So what we're going to do, turn this on, and please watch the diagram here. The React application, and I'll show you where this happens afterwards, is listening for changes to the feature flags, and it will change instantly when I change this. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, maybe I did break something. So we can see, let's see, I'm just going to reload just to see. Yeah, okay. Got some funkiness with those lines. It's struggling to, I think I made it. This is where I did make a bug. So what happened here is what should be happening is we're talking to the new API now, and the new API is talking to the old database. Apologies for the fuzziness there. I'll not try and fix that live because I'm sure I'll just ham it up here. But now it looks like things are working. Let's see if we can see some data that's coming back. And I'm just going to pull this over so we can see data coming back. And we can see now that we're serving from version 2 of the API, just like what we're supposed to be surfacing here, even if the visual doesn't quite get it right. Okay. And so what we're going to do from here is we're going to migrate that database. And this is where we're actually going to introduce an error. So I'm going to hide the debug again. Okay, just move this guy over a little. And I'm going to enable what is technically an incorrect configuration here. And so when I enable the new database, the old API doesn't actually support this. And so it's going to produce an error. Okay, cool. Well, at least my dotted lines settled out there. I think I just had a logic problem in how I was animating the lines. So you can see now we have cut over to the new API, and we're going to the new database. Let's take a look at the data that we're getting in that debug panel. I apologize. That's where I messed it up. This is what I was trying to produce here. Apologies. So in a case where we're on API version 1, that's the mistake I made. The idea here is that I migrated to the new database, and the old API does not support the new database. We're getting back an error now. We're not serving data unsupported configuration. So what I want to do is walk that back instantly. So I'm going to turn that back here. We're going to cut back, and you can see instantaneously when that flag changes, React gets the indication that the flag state has changed and queries the API again. And instantly, we've resolved that outage. Okay. So because I transitioned the database first, which is not a supported configuration for this application, let's see if we can build in some safeguards that will make it safer to roll this out, and so we don't introduce that. And before we move ahead, let's just remember what we just saw there, which is the kill switch. As soon as I turn that off, we were able to immediately remediate the issue. Okay, let's drag this over for a second here. So there's two things. One, I blasted that change out to our entire user base. And that means everybody was affected by it all at once. So alternatively, what we could do is start adding targets, and we could target this release for particular users. Now I heard folks are seeing the login, so I'm going to try and add the login one more time here and see if I have any luck. Oh, there we go. All right. I think it just needed to make me feel bad. All right, so now we have a login button. And what I'm going to do is let's target just our delivery team. So if you want to follow along and have this change targeted to you, you can log in now as developer. And the password is optional. I know that's not terribly secure, but I trust you. Okay, now we're logged in as developer. You can see in the upper corner, hello developer. Okay. We're going to turn this feature on, but what we're going to do is leave everybody else in the user base targeted as getting the old or the legacy database. And we're going to add a rule that says if the user is in a segment of the delivery team, and remember that's that developer that we log in as, they will get the new data source. And so when I change this, what will happen is that all of us that are logged in as developer, or anybody who comes to log in as developer, will see this change. Everybody else will be isolated from it. In fact, I'll show you here, and we'll log out just to prove it. Okay, making my screen a little bigger here. Okay, so we can see we're logged in as developer, and we can see we're getting that error again. How do I know this is not hitting the rest of the users though? I'm going to log out and go back to being a regular user. And when I log out, my context has changed. Identity, my username came out of the context, and I go back to being this anonymous user who is getting the default data here. All right, going to log back in as developer so we can finish debugging this and reworking it. All right, so we're in this error state. We know our users are safe. I'll hide that debug menu for now. Okay, here's what we're going to do to safeguard ourselves. So LaunchDarkly has this idea of prerequisites where we can tell a flag that it can't be on unless another flag is in a certain state. And we're going to do that here because we shouldn't have released the new database version without releasing the new API version. So let's do that now. Here we'll add a prerequisite, and we're going to rely on our API connection configuration. In particular, we want to make sure that it's on version 2 for this to be true. And so now the prerequisite says if API configuration is version 2, then this will be true. Otherwise, it'll be false. Okay, and you can see as soon as I made that change, because the API version 2 is not yet released, that means even our development team got put back to our old database. If I zoom in here, you can see we're now going to the old database, okay? Because this prerequisite rule supersedes this one. Okay, now let's go and release that change. And again, we'll learn from what we just failed at here. And we're going to drive that blast radius down just to our delivery team, okay? And by doing this, we're going to allow ourselves to test in production. So back to that question of environments and how many environments do I need? Well, it depends. If I can safely test in production, especially for my delivery team or to a select audience, I need fewer environments. All right, let's turn this on. And so let's see. Here, I'm going to learn from that lesson, and I'm going to add that same rule here. Is in segment. Everybody else will still get version 1. And so what we've done now is we updated the rules for this. When we changed to migrate to API version 2, the prerequisite was met for the database flag, and you can see we're now flowing to the new database as well. Let's see it in that debug panel. All right, and you see now we're not only on API version 2, but we're serving from DynamoDB, which is our new database. Now, it's great to target your own team or a testing team for this, but how do we roll out in other ways? And so I'm going to log out, and we can see as soon as I log out, my context has changed. I'm back to the old API. All right. Let's see if we could target this change to another group. And so let's take a look here. So right now our database configuration is set to use the legacy data source, unless you're on the delivery team. And our API configuration only targets the delivery team. Let's add another rule. I'm on the East Coast, and what I've done is use I set the context of the rule set here so that it could use time zone, browser, CPU, and a variety of information that we get from a user. So here I'm going to include time zone and is one of, and we'll say We'll do America, New York. Oh, look at this. Oh, great. I've got so many here. You know what? I'll do a couple. I'll do it for myself so everybody can see it on screen. And this will allow me to get API version 2, but I should still be on the old database because that hasn't been enabled for me. I'm going to save this now so we can see it on my screen. Okay, great. So we can see I am now on version 2 of the API. I'm still on the old database. Okay, so the configuration is working as expected. Let's actually, I'm going to turn this on for a few of you other folks here. All right, so user, and I think I can do this by, yeah, let's see, we won't just, let's get Canada, let's get Paris. Love it. Okay, so here, now I'm going to turn this on. Nothing's going to change for me. A number of you folks should see something different. Okay. So that targeting rule now affects all those different regions. If we wanted, that was a very bold change of me. It's likely that a change like this probably would have needed approval. So let's look at this. Let's imagine we're going to do one more change here, just like this one. We're still going to use time zone. And let's say I pick Los Angeles, which I didn't pick. Okay. Now, let's imagine the West Coast is a very big region. There's a lot of impact. We have a big customer base there. Imagine I need additional approval for that. So when I go to save, here's where I might request approval. And so I could pick, let's say, my boss for approving this. And so what would happen now is if I request approval, this will go into a pending state. And that change didn't expect to be popped up. I think I canceled that just soon. That change would go into a pending state until it gets approved. Additionally, it's easy to create workflows. And so what we could do is do say a progressive rollout. I'm just going to do a custom workflow here where we can see we wanted to formalize this. If this is a process we repeat, we could say request an approval. Again, I'll just ask my boss for his approval. And then this is where we would add flag changes. And so we would target a group. We would say user, time zone, and we'd say Los Angeles. Great. And for them, we'll turn it on. And again, once I start this workflow, it'll progress to the approval. Additionally, you could have additional layers of approval with other regional or time-based releases. I won't bother starting it now. Okay, let's keep going. The other part that happened here was when I broke things before, we had to manually fix it. And we had to manually see if there was an error. If we had an APM tool, it would have told us, hey, people are getting errors now. And that would be nice, but how long until I get paged? How long until I get it resolved? And so what we could do here is add a flag trigger. And so I would take, let's see, actually, I'm going to take the database configuration flag because that was the one that gave us the problem in the end. When we migrated to this new database, it wasn't supported by the old API. So what we do here is if we go to settings, you can add a trigger, and you can see here that I can use Datadog events, Dynatrace, New Relic, Honeycomb, or I can use a generic trigger, which is a webhook, which means you can integrate from anywhere. My favorite has been to use Datadog events so far because there were so many times when I got a page in the middle of the night from an event or a monitor from Datadog that I would have liked to not have to woken up for. Here, I could have just switched off, as we've done here, turned targeting to off for this database flag, and it would have immediately remediated the issue. All right, let's back out of that and go back to our feature flags page here. Okay, so we've got our prerequisite built in now. It is... Now, our database hasn't yet been released either. And so it's relying on the targeted groups here for the API connection. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and release, and actually, yeah, we'll do it by time zone here. So this way, if you were thinking about why you might do this with a database and progressively ramp up traffic or take a percent of traffic. In fact, because oftentimes we're trying to prove out that a database will scale. And so what we're going to do instead here is we're going to do a percentage rollout. And so we'll do a 50% legacy data source. Actually, we'll go more cautious than this. We'll go 80/20. And so this is done by user key, and so it'll start to distribute that across users. It's still bound by the rules that are targeting the API connection configuration as well. Okay, let's see. I'm curious if anything changes for me as we change this. You'll see I'm part of the 20% that goes to the new database now. I imagine not all of us are. Let's see if I log in as another me. I'm in that group as well. So let's see. Now that we've fixed that and we've looked at some regional rollout rules or some progressive rollouts, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and release this to everyone now. We can decide if we want to change that going forward. It will still only match for the targeted groups that we have on the API. If anybody's feeling left out, please let me know. I'm happy to add your group to the API targeting, or we can release it to everyone. So now we can dig into some of this source code and look at how some of this works. So we'll be able to see in the React application, how do we gate components with feature flags? How do we use the React hooks to be able to get the feature flag values and listen to them to drive other changes? We'll also dig into our Lambda function and look at how we're using the SDK there and how the server-side SDK differs from the client-side SDK. If there's any questions as we're going along, please give a shout. I'm happy to answer anything now before we get going into the code or as we get there. Matter of fact, I will just go ahead and release that change to everybody now too. Feel like it's working well. So I'm going to just release it to all. Great. And so even if I log out here, I should see I'm still flowing here. And again, I think the debug panel will illustrate that as well. And we've already seen that with the talking migration. The other thing that we'll see here too, if we want evidence that we are in fact using a different API, is that the shape of the data has changed. And so if I were to switch back to the API version 1, you'd see that the shape of data in root is different. So this one has meta and it has data, because what I did was I divided these response attributes. So like for instance, for the API database, I wanted to capture what values we were serving up as the variations there and what we were using to target, and separate that from the data. So if I very quickly just turn this flag off, you'll see I go back to this other shape of data, which has all of this data sitting right next to items. So the shape really has changed. We are serving two different APIs from that Lambda function. All right, let's go dive in now. Hide this. All right, I think my screen's got a little disorganized. So, all right, this looks like the one. Oh, great. Oh, yes. Okay, great question. Okay, so question from Eric. Are you passing the URL value through the toggle? Yes, I am. And so let me show you how that's done. I'm really glad you brought it up. I didn't go deep enough into that. So one of the things that I was excited to find out when I joined LaunchDarkly is that they not only support Boolean feature flags, which a lot of us are familiar with as toggles, they have multivariate flags, which allow you to create feature flags that are strings, numbers, or JSON objects. And that's exactly what I've done here. And so you can see here in this box, this is a JSON object. I've got the API version 2. That's informing the configuration of the client and the API and the Lambda function, as well as the base URL for the API. And so you see here, when we're on version 2, we have the version 2 URL. These happen to be the same base URL as well, just with a different path attribute. They could be entirely different API routes as well. Thanks, that's a great question. Additionally, I'll just show it real quick here. The database configuration is configured much the same way. And so here I've configured the, I've configured the bucket name, an indicator for the data source itself as S3, and the actual file that we're querying in S3. Likewise, I've configured DynamoDB as a data source here, and the table name. And so that makes my code now very configurable. And so we move from this idea of having to have lots of conditional statements in my code to have this kind of flexibility to having it be remotely configurable. Okay. Oh, and I'm sorry, looks like there's another question. If the trigger is fired, can it notify you that it turned the feature flag off? Yes. So one of the things you can do is we have integrations with Slack and other team messaging tools. And so what you can do is every time a flag changes, you can have a number of triggers, and oftentimes teams use these to be notified in their team communication channels. All right, let's dive into our React app. And folks, please, as things come up, I know we're getting close on time, so I'm going to try to go quickly through this. Throw any other questions you have at me. Okay, so here's how it looks to use LaunchDarkly in your code. Just like any other dependency, we install it. This works the same for all our SDKs in all the languages. In React, we use React hooks to be able to get a handle to those feature flags. And we'll use the hook use LD client to get a handle on the client. And we'll use this for adding to the context. Remember I talked about capturing browser and identity information to be able to inform those the rule sets for how we evaluate feature flags. Here's an example of that. So when the login feature changes, so that's the ability to log in or the ability to log in or log out. When that changes, if it's no longer enabled, we clear identity from the context. And that means every rule evaluation after that will be based on excluding the name. The user is now anonymous. Here's what it looks like to gate a change. And so in React, if JSX is unfamiliar, this is basically a component here. I've hidden the complexity of the inside components. Sorry, it's probably a little messy too. But here we've got either the login component or the data debug panel has to be enabled to be able to show this component. And finally, here's another example, a little less basic, where we are gating both using a stateful variable here and also feature flag. And what we're doing is actually using it to render two completely different things that really change the layout of our screen. If you saw when I enabled debug, it moves the other, or it makes it so that we can have this other chunk over on the other side of the screen if the debug panel is open. And so it allows us to resize and reshape the interface. So I've mentioned context a few times. And so I want to show you exactly what it looks like. So in this case, when the user logs in, we capture that event. So here they're clicking login. We captured their username. We put it in state. But what we also do is we use that instance of the LaunchDarkly client to identify, and that is to add context here. And so what we're doing here is we take all the existing context, maintain it, and add the username to it. This allows us to be able to target individually, like we saw with developer. And here we've got another case where we're using context, but this is where we're sharing that context with an API now. And so you can imagine if there was identity attached to this request, it would likely be on the server side to kind of validate that identity. Here we're being very trusting, and I'm sending everything we know about the client context into our API request, and we're sending it as query string parameters. This way, the API can act on the same information that the UI has. All right, and so I'm going to jump over to our server-side code now. So this is our Lambda function. And again, you'll see it's pretty unobtrusive to include LaunchDarkly. You'll see it's that one-line dependency added here. And since this is a Lambda function, and we want to put things outside our functions that are reusable so that we don't incur the cost of reinstantiating or reinitializing each time, what we've done is initialize outside of our function call, outside of our handler. And while we get into the function, though, you can see as soon as we get into processing, before we start tackling anything that would require our rules, we're waiting for the LaunchDarkly initialization. So typically this is 25 milliseconds or less. That is to reach out to the CDN and download the initial rule set. Next, we're setting up the context for the user. That is, we're giving an ID here. We're also passing in all those other, or taking all those other things off the query string, like the username, time zone. And that's how we're able to do targeting here on the server side as well. We identify that user in the context. Okay. And then we use that context to go and evaluate those rule sets. So here we've given a default rule set. That is, if we can't connect to the LaunchDarkly flag delivery network, what's our default position on this? It's to use the original S3 bucket and table. This is the name of the feature flag we're getting. And in this case, I've requested the variation detail. So I not only get the variation, what the outcome is, but also the detail about how the decision was made. All right, we're about the very end here, and I want to give you time for Q&A. So let's see. I want to see if there's anything else I must show you here. All right, last piece I want to show you in here is here's where we're using that API configuration and the API version to inform the behavior of the Lambda function. We're using the feature flag to control the shape of the data we return. So here you can see in version 1, we're returning that body where everything is put together, the metadata included. And if we don't return from version 1, then here we are separating metadata and the actual data itself in the response. All right, that is it for me. The only part left would be other slides or pictures. And so let me turn that off for now. Stop sharing. Now, what else can I dig into for you? I'd love to hear if you have any Q&A, particular problems you're challenged with. Great. Okay, we've got a nice pile of Q&A here. Excellent. All right, let's dig into some of that. So let's see. Question from Ken. Let's see. It's great to see how LaunchDarkly can help making it easier to migrate. What if you're migrating to LaunchDarkly? Great question. Okay, so you bring up a good point, Kenneth. One of the things I love to share with folks is that adopting LaunchDarkly to start feature flagging is not a big chasm to cross. There is no re-architecture, redesign of the way you do things. Because of the unobtrusive way in which you can start including it in parts of your project, you don't have to include it in your whole project yet. And so that means you can start feature flagging a component or a piece at a time. And I think ideally, that's also exactly what we're doing in migration, right? Is gating off those pieces and moving a little bit at a time. What are some transitionary steps teams can take? So I think this is start small. Always start small. Start the finest grain you can and build up from there. And that's where you're going to build the confidence in both the platform and its reliability. And reach out, because I'd love to talk more about that. The question of how to start adopting is really interesting. Okay, how does LaunchDarkly compare to other tools such as Harness? It's a great question. There's a lot I don't know about other feature flagging platforms or other feature management platforms. What I do know is that from what I've seen, LaunchDarkly has a really comprehensive set of enterprise-grade tools like around role-based access controls. We have an exceptionally resilient network. We're delivering 20 trillion feature flag evaluations a day, which is kind of a staggering number to me. The other key for us that again, kind of orients us toward the enterprise is that we've built a lot of capabilities around feature flags. So that is experimentation, really advanced targeting rules, again, by any context, as well as workflows, automation, and that suite of tools. So I think I can't really speak to our competition. I can tell you that's some of what our offering looks like. Okay, let's see. So from Christopher, what does LaunchDarkly offer to assist with the more complicated migration, which is that 2 databases are now out of sync? That's a really good question. So that is a challenge, right? That I've got 2 databases, and depending on where I'm taking writes and how do I keep them in sync? For that, we don't offer a solution. In fact, I imagine you'd use some sort of change data capture tool for keeping those in sync. Most likely what I would do in a real world database migration is migrate my reads first. And as long as I had enough consistency so that I could get, or I had a level of consistency I was comfortable in getting reads from both databases, I would be comfortable transitioning some reads to the new database. Transitioning writes is definitely a scary part of the migration. That's where I think your kill switch comes in, to be able to back off instantly if you need to. It is certainly a complex problem, though. Okay, so got it. If the, let's see, Eugene, I think we covered this one. Yeah, so can we get notified on a feature flag change? Yes, you can. Check out our integrations page. We cover the APM tools, the team collaboration tools there, and we have an SDK page where you can see the 25 plus SDKs we have. Okay, we covered the, are you passing the URL as part of the toggle? Yep. Donald, how are feature flags obtained in the unlikely event that LaunchDarkly is down? Oh, that's a great question. So what caching is available? So first of all, we have 6 layers of resiliency built in. So it starts in our SDK where you can set default values. All feature flag evaluations are done in memory. That's why they're so fast. And so that means you have a cache there. And so if an SDK can't reach the flag delivery network, it will use its existing cache. It also in the background is self-healing. And so it will keep trying to connect to get a refreshed rule set. And so beyond that, we have our flag delivery network is a CDN with over 100 points of presence globally. So again, that access to the network is virtually guaranteed. And then at our core, we're a multi-availability zone architected platform. And so we cover a wide geographic area. And so there's a lot of integrity in the platform that way. Let's see. Okay, great question here. Christopher Baldwin, can LaunchDarkly assist with varying credentials based on the different targets? Yes. Okay. Good question. So I think in general, I would say don't put secret things like credentials in LaunchDarkly. It's it's better for you to maintain those in some kind of secret store. I think, yes, you could use LaunchDarkly to gate the decision over which credential to use in your code. Yeah, and I think that would be an additional conditional block. You might be able to put an identifier for it. So like the username is typically not a secret thing, but the password is. And so that username or part of a connection string could be included in LaunchDarkly. Federico, for a feature flag, the targeting rules include a country field. It's always empty in my project. Why is that? That's a great question. I'm going to share really quick and show you why. I know we are close on time. So share this screen again. Okay, so why aren't we seeing country, even though we saw country in the dashboard? It's because when we capture, so I have a user agent component here. And that user agent component, you don't see it here, I see. I think we can see it better in the Lambda function. So we're not sending in country. That's what it comes down to. So I put something in here to capture time zone based on how the browser is informed. However, we don't capture country. We could have, and I've played with adding other location information here so we could target in other ways regionally. And that is a popular way to use the product. So I've talked with folks in London a few weeks ago about targeted rollouts across a variety of countries in Africa. And so anything you know about the context of that request, whether you're on a mobile device, web, you can use that to do targeting. It's just that we don't have any of that data that's come in from our requests right now. Let's see, let's kill the share here. Okay, any suggestions for feature flagging different versions of an NPM package that an app depends on? Oh, that's a really good question. Because of the way, so it almost feels like, I think the way I might look at that is I would probably have individual components. So when we looked at how we gated React components, and you could do that with anywhere else in any language that you're using with LaunchDarkly. But effectively, wherever I'm using that package, which is the older version and the newer version, I would gate the decision of which component to serve behind a feature flag. And each component could be using a different version of that. In that case, you'd have to have both versions installed. I think, and that's an approach I'm less familiar with in NPM. Let's see. Oh, okay, so there's a question here about the relay proxy. The relay proxy is a tool that we offer. It's open source. and you can go check it out. We have it's a Docker image that you can run. We have a blog post about how to run it in ECS as a serverless Fargate task, also backed by DynamoDB as its cache. When to use it is the most common case. The best case for it is when you are in a private network that you cannot reach out of. So if you can imagine being in a VPC, and so you do not have internet access outside of that, you only have access through a proxy. In this case, it would be the relay proxy. Still, the best case is typically to connect to the flag delivery network because it has the high level of resilience, more nines than you're going to be able to have by running your own containers, and you will not incur costs from all the responsiveness that you get out of it. So that's the case for the relay proxy typically, though. The other case is when you have private data you don't want to send and you want to cache closer to your applications. That'd be another reason to use the relay proxy. Let's see. The fundamental issue with the two out-of-sync databases is that LaunchDarkly has to stop routing back. That's an LD area of responsibility. Yeah, Christopher, I'd love to talk more about this because I've talked in depth with some other friends who were also in the enterprise architecture space about this challenge and how would we gate that decision? How would we use LaunchDarkly there? Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect. Happy to have a chat. Love to get together and talk about it. We have any other? So I think I covered all the questions I saw. Anything else that comes to mind? I know we're getting close to the end here. Everybody did get the links, right? Those will also be part of the video. Feel free to check out the source code on this. Okay, let's see. All right. If that's all, folks, since I lost my slide share, I won't try and pull that up at the last second here, but I'd encourage you to go check out our integrations and our SDKs and remember what we saw here today. We saw us instantly revert a migration gone bad. We saw the ability to create dependencies between our components or between our features, also adding in organizational layers of approvals and things like that. And see if there was anything else here. Oh, and by the way, I wish I had had my slides up still. If you saw the list of customers we work with too, some of those questions around resilience or availability are answered there because we work with some of the largest companies in the world and serve at a massive scale with them. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Please reach out if you have questions or want to chat. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I think it's that same smiley face you saw before on my slides. It looks a lot like me. Thank you very much. Take care.